In the shadowed corridors of ancient Susa, where gold shimmered on the skins of slaves and incense masked the scent of death, history buried a secret few dared to name. Beneath the throne of the great king, hundreds of women lived and vanished, not as lovers, but as offerings to empire. Their beauty was currency, their silence law, and their pain the unseen mortar that held a dynasty together. Yet within those perfumed walls, whispers spoke of forbidden births, drowned brides, and a curse that haunted Persia long after its kings were dust. Tonight, we open the sealed doors of that harem to uncover the lost truth of the concubines of Susa and the sexual secrets that built an empire of ghosts. In the heart of Susa, where the Euphrates whispered through gardens heavy with pomegranate and myrrh, the citadel rose like a monument to divine desire. Above, the great king ruled as god and mortal combined. Below, unseen by men save a chosen few, the royal harem sprawled in quiet magnificence, a world of silk, mirrors, and despair. The harem was not merely a dwelling. It was a fortress of flesh. Its corridors were guarded by eunuchs whose eyes never lifted above the marble floor, and whose tongues had long forgotten the softness of speech. Beyond those gilded gates lived more than 1,000 women, daughters of defeated kings, slaves of conquered nations, and children stolen from distant provinces. Each bore a new name, Persianized to erase the memory of her homeland. The empire called them Anasha, those who served the light of the king. But within those chambers, they called themselves the Forgotten. Their day began before dawn. They bathed in rose water drawn from copper basins, their bodies inspected for blemishes as if they were jewels presented for sale. The elder attendants painted their eyes with antimony and their lips with crushed carmine, preparing them not for worship, but for judgment. For when the king descended, his gaze alone could seal their fate. A touch meant favor, averted eyes meant banishment, and disfavor often meant disappearance. To the world outside, they were the envy of women. To themselves, they were prisoners gilded in perfume. The harem's overseer was a eunuch named Parnaka, once a soldier from Media. His mutilation had been his initiation, his silence his command. He alone carried the king's messages between the outer court and this inner labyrinth. It was said he never wept, though he had seen girls carried away in silence, their anklets still echoing against the stone long after their hearts had stopped. In one chamber, a young woman from Babylon traced her name in dust upon the mosaic floor. Amat Ishtar, it once was. Now she was called Daria, meaning the pearl. Her beauty had been praised in the markets of Susa and purchased by decree of the royal treasurer. Yet in the harem, her beauty became a curse, a reminder that the king's favor was as deadly as his wrath. Daria learned quickly that the harem was not ruled by the king, but by the queen mother, Atosa, whose word carried the weight of heaven. The queen mother's spies watched every gesture, every whisper. Rumors spoke of a secret chamber where rivals were stripped of their hair and left to wither in the dark, a fate worse than death in a world where beauty was power. That night, Daria stood before the reflecting pool, where lamps burned in bowls of oil, their flames trembling like captive souls. She gazed at her reflection, painted and perfect, and wondered how long it would take before the mirror no longer knew her face. Above her, the citadel thundered with music. Below, the harem waited in silence, a silence so deep it seemed to breathe. And in that silence began the story of the concubines of Susa, where desire was law and obedience the only way to die beautifully. When the moon hung low over Susa, pale and watchful as an unblinking god, the queen mother issued her decree: the great king must have an heir. The empire whispered that the womb of the harem was the womb of Persia itself, and it must never fall barren. Within those words lay terror, for the search for an heir meant the weighing of bodies and the sacrifice of innocence. From dawn until dusk, the harem became a theater of fertility. Midwives scoured the chambers, testing pulses, reading omens, measuring hips, and counting moons of bleeding. The concubines stood in silence, stripped of veils and shame alike, as oils glistened on their skin under the judgmental eyes of the attendants. No sound broke the stillness except the distant rhythm of the water clocks, marking time in heartbeats. Daria was among those chosen for the king's purification rites, a practice older than the empire itself. It was said the god Ahura Mazda favored purity, and through ritual bathing and sacred union, divine favor would be restored to the royal line. But among the women, another whisper moved, that the queen mother sought not purity, but power. In the gardens of the harem, under fig trees heavy with fruit, the women were made to drink a potion brewed from crushed pomegranate seeds, poppy, and goat's blood. The midwives called it the milk of immortality. It dulled their senses, left their limbs trembling and minds clouded with dreams. What happened in the ritual that followed was spoken of only in fragments soaked in tears and fever. One said that the king entered the chamber blindfolded, guided by priests chanting verses of fertility. Another claimed that the women were bound in silk, their faces painted with gold, offered like idols to the divine. Daria remembered only the scent, frankincense, musk, and iron, and the heavy silence after the chanting stopped. When dawn broke, some of the women were carried out, lifeless, their lips still stained red from the potion. The priests said the gods had claimed them as vessels too pure for mortal seed. Others were anointed with oils and declared chosen. Daria was among them. From that day, her name was recorded in the royal annals, not as Daria the woman, but Daria the fertile. She was fed honey and saffron to sweeten her womb, bathed in milk, and confined to the inner chambers, forbidden to speak to any man save the king or his attendants. The eunuchs watched her with eyes that held neither pity nor warmth, for to show mercy was treason. Weeks passed. Each morning, the Queen Mother's astrologer marked the stars, charting destinies written in the heavens. Daria's name appeared in his scrolls more than once, besides symbols of the serpent and the sun. The midwives whispered that her bloodline was touched by something divine, something that frightened even the king. When the great king finally came to her chamber, his presence was like a storm breaking over still water. She knelt, trembling, as he placed his hand upon her head and whispered words that sounded more like command than blessing. That night, Daria understood the truth no priest dared to write. The women of Susa were not mothers of heirs. They were offerings to an empire that fed upon its own desire. And as she lay beneath the shadow of the king's hand, she realized the most dangerous secret of all, that even in divine unions there was no love, only survival. In the ancient courts of Persia, loyalty was measured not in words, but in what a man was willing to lose. The eunuchs of Susa were living proof, guardians carved from betrayal, their devotion sealed by the blade. They moved like shadows between the living and the forgotten, neither fully men nor entirely ghosts. Among them was Parnaka, master of the harem, the silent watcher of the king's treasures. Once a soldier of Media, he had been captured in youth, his manhood taken as the price of servitude. The pain of that night never left him, though the scars had long healed. When he spoke, his voice was a low whisper, as though every word passed through an open wound. To the women, Parnaka was a phantom, neither threat nor comfort. He brought food, scrolls, and orders from the Queen Mother, but his eyes never lingered. Yet behind his restraint lived a secret torment. He remembered what it was to love, and that memory was forbidden. Each dawn, he inspected the chambers, recording who had bled, who had conceived, who had vanished. His records were written not in ink, but in symbols known only to him, a secret language of sorrow. He knew which women wept in silence, which plotted escape, and which still prayed to gods forgotten by Persia's priests. When Daria's name appeared among the chosen, Parnaka hesitated. She reminded him of someone he once knew, a wife left behind when he was taken. Her eyes carried that same quiet defiance, the flicker of a spirit not yet broken. Against his better judgment, He lingered near her chamber longer than duty required. One evening, he found her by the pool, staring at her reflection as if trying to remember the face beneath the paint. She did not speak, but her eyes met his, and in that glance passed an understanding deeper than language. It was dangerous. In Susa, a glance could condemn both giver and receiver. Parnaka knew the punishments well. He had carried out enough of them. He had seen women buried alive in the salt pits beneath the citadel for whispering a lover's name. Yet something inside him, something human, stirred again. He began to alter his records. When Daria missed a ritual, he marked her as unwell. When she bled outside the moon's schedule, he erased the entry entirely. In a world ruled by ink and decree, the smallest lie was rebellion. But secrets in the harem never slept long. The Queen Mother's spies noticed the changes. They watched Parnaka closely, whispering of disloyalty. One morning, he was summoned to the upper chamber. There, beneath a mural of the king's triumphs, Atossa herself awaited him. "Your duty," she said, her voice like silk drawn across a blade, "is to protect the sanctity of the royal blood, not to shield the impure." Parnaka bowed. He did not defend himself. The Queen Mother studied him a long moment, then smiled. "Every eunuch forgets," she murmured. "But I have ways of reminding." That night, he returned to his quarters, shaking. From the far corridor came the soft cries of a girl being taken to the punishment chamber. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in years, he prayed, not to be forgiven, but to forget. Yet in the stillness of that night, as the lamps flickered out one by one, Parnaka knew the truth. It was not the women who were enslaved, it was all of them, bound to a god that fed only on obedience and silence. The command came with the first breath of spring, a season of renewal, though in Susa it meant the renewal of fear. The Queen Mother decreed a great feast to honor the gods of fertility and the endurance of the royal bloodline. The king himself would attend, and with him, the full measure of his favor and wrath. For 3 days the palace blazed with preparation. Perfume makers crushed petals into oil until the courtyards ran red with scent. Musicians tuned their lyres, and slaves scrubbed the marble floors until they shone like mirrors. The women of the harem were bathed, painted, and dressed in silk so thin they trembled with every breath. Daria was among them, her body adorned with strands of lapis and gold, her wrists bound in silk to mark her as blessed of the king. Yet beneath the splendor, the air was heavy with unease. Parnaka moved through the corridors like a wraith, carrying trays of wine and messages from the upper court. His face betrayed nothing, but his eyes searched constantly for what he did not know. Perhaps for a chance to save what could no longer be saved. As night fell, the king entered the banquet hall. The courtiers rose as one, bowing low as the monarch of nations took his seat upon the golden dais. His face was painted with kohl, his beard perfumed with myrrh, and around his neck hung a chain of rubies, the spoils of conquered lands. At his side sat the Queen Mother, veiled in white, her eyes cold and unyielding. The feast began in song and laughter. Platters of roasted lamb and honeyed figs passed from hand to trembling hand. Musicians played hymns to Ahura Mazda, while dancers moved like living flames across the mosaic floor. The king's gaze wandered over the assembled concubines, resting at last upon Daria. She felt the weight of his eyes and lowered hers, but not before the Queen Mother noticed. A shadow crossed the elder woman's face, brief but deadly. Moments later, the queen raised her goblet, a cup of beaten gold adorned with the emblem of the lion. "To the fruit of the king's seed," she declared, "and to the purity of the chosen wombs." The court echoed her words, unaware that beneath her ring lay a vial, small, translucent, and deadly. Parnaka, standing by the pillar, saw it, the faint glimmer of liquid as she tilted her cup. The servant who refilled the king's chalice hesitated, just long enough for her to switch the cups. None but Parnaka noticed. None but he knew the meaning of that glance between mother and son. The king raised the goblet to his lips, then paused. His eyes met Atossa's. For a heartbeat, the hall was silent, and then he laughed, setting the cup down untasted. The queen mother's smile did not falter, but her hand trembled. Somewhere, in the distance, a servant collapsed, choking, his face contorted in agony. The poison had found another vessel. Panic rippled through the feast. The music faltered. Daria clutched her cup, her breath caught between prayer and scream. Parnaka turned away, for he understood too well. The queen had not meant to kill her son, but to remind him that even kings could bleed. That night, the courtiers whispered of curses, of divine warnings, of omens written in wine and blood. But beneath the laughter that returned to the hall, a new fear was born, a fear that the poison of power had begun to seep through the very veins of the empire. And in the harem below, where silence was law, the women waited, knowing that when the king's trust wavered, it was always their bodies that paid the price. After the feast, Susa fell into an uneasy quiet. The king had not spoken of the poison. The queen mother remained in her chambers, veiled and watchful. But within the harem, the silence thickened into something tangible, a weight that pressed upon the air. The concubines whispered of omens, of spirits offended, of the gods turning their faces from the royal house. Then, one dawn, a girl vanished. She was called Nisara, a Median dancer favored by the king for her laughter, the only sound in the harem that seemed alive. Her chamber was found empty, her anklets left neatly beside the pool. The guards said she had been summoned to the queen mother's court, but no one saw her return. By nightfall, the whisper had spread. The king's anger had returned to the harem. In Susa, the harem was said to have many secret places, rooms built for pleasure, for punishment, and for silence. Yet none were spoken of with more fear than the chamber of the drowned bride. It lay beneath the eastern garden, accessible only by a narrow stair where torches burned without smoke. No one entered without permission. No one returned without a stain of salt on their feet. Daria first heard the name from an old servant as they folded linens near the bathing hall. "The water remembers," the woman murmured, eyes lowered. "It remembers every lie told to the king." That night, Daria dreamt of the pool. In her dream, the surface glimmered like glass, and beneath it, faces turned, pale, hair drifting like black weeds. When she woke, her pillow was wet with sweat, and the sound of dripping water echoed faintly beyond her chamber wall. 2 days later, the eunuchs sealed the harem gates. Parnaka came to read the decree. All women were confined until further notice. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he rolled the scroll. Daria saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the look of a man who carried more graves in his memory than any soldier. At dusk, she followed him through the corridor to deliver oil for the lamps. As they passed the lower stair, a faint hum rose from below, not music, but the sound of water moving against stone. Parnaka stopped. "You should not be here," he whispered. But Daria had already seen it, the door of bronze, carved with lily and serpents. Later that night, the chamber opened again. The guards brought a girl wrapped in white silk, her hair adorned with myrtle. The priests called it a ceremony of cleansing. The king watched from behind a screen, unseen, his face a shadow in the lamplight. The girl was led to the pool, her wrists bound in ribbons. She did not struggle. The attendants lowered her slowly until the ripples swallowed her breath. When her body stilled, the priests chanted, and the queen mother dropped a petal into the water, an offering to purity restored. By morning, the chamber was silent again. The water lay smooth as marble, the lily floating above its stillness. Daria heard the news from the same old servant. "Nisara has been purified," she said simply. "The king's peace will return." But in Daria's heart, peace was gone forever. For now she understood what every woman in Susa eventually learned, that in the palace of the great king, Beauty was never possessed. It was drowned again and again until nothing remained but reflection. Weeks passed after the drowning. The gardens bloomed again, as if nature had forgotten. But within the harem, laughter had withered. Every woman spoke softly now, watching her words as if the air itself carried spies. Daria, once light-hearted and curious, now walked with lowered eyes, her spirit fading beneath the weight of unseen fear. Then, in the late summer, a rumor began to spread, a whisper that carried more danger than any blade. Someone in the royal harem was with child. At first, it seemed impossible. The king had not visited the women in months, and those chosen were always attended, examined, and confined under the watch of the queen mother's matrons. But the whispers persisted. A forbidden pregnancy, it was said, conceived not of royal blood, but of secret union, a sin punishable by death. Daria did not believe it, until one night, while helping the old servant bring wine to the bathing hall, she heard quiet sobs echoing from the alcove. Behind the curtain, she saw her friend Elish, a Lydian girl with eyes like wet amber, clutching her belly in pain. "Help me," Elish begged, her voice trembling. "They must not know." The truth struck Daria with the weight of stone. Elish was the one. She had been chosen by a nobleman, once sent as a messenger from the satrap's court. Their glances had met during the spring festival. Their secret, she confessed, had bloomed only in stolen hours beneath the pomegranate trees. Now her belly had begun to swell, and the queen mother's spies were everywhere. Daria hid her, bringing herbs and cloths at night. They spoke in whispers, imagining a life beyond Susa, beyond the gilded cage. Elish would flee, she promised, once the child was born. Perhaps the messenger would return for her. Perhaps love could defy an empire built on silence. But fate had long abandoned mercy in the house of Achaemenes. One dawn, the queen mother's attendants came. The harem was searched, chamber by chamber. When they reached the corner room, Daria's hands were slick with sweat. Behind the tapestry, Elish trembled, holding her breath. But one of the eunuchs noticed the disturbed cushions, the faint scent of myrrh in the air. The curtain was pulled aside. They dragged Elish away screaming. Daria followed at a distance until the bronze door of the chamber of the drowned bride closed once more. Yet that day, no water was used. The punishment for such a crime, the priest said, required the purging of both mother and seed. Elish was taken to the lower courtyard, a place Daria had never seen before. There, amid incense and chanting, the queen mother stood beside a basin of bronze, its rim carved with ancient symbols of purity. The air smelled of metal and sorrow. The child was taken from her before it ever drew breath. The king did not appear. His silence was consent enough. When it was over, Elish was buried in an unmarked pit near the river. Her name was erased from the harem records. That night, the eunuchs poured salt into the bathing pools to cleanse the memory of Sign. But Daria could not forget. Every time she touched water, she saw Elish's face reflected there, not in death, but in defiance, as if her spirit still wandered the corridors, seeking the child that never was. The rumor of the forbidden's birth spread beyond Susa, whispered among merchants and slaves alike. Some said the queen mother feared a prophecy, that a child born of impurity would one day bring ruin to the royal line. And from that day, Daria knew, no secret in Susa stayed buried. It only changed its shape and waited for its next victim. After Elish's death, the harem did not mourn aloud. The air itself seemed forbidden to carry grief. Yet every woman moved more slowly, as if the ground beneath them had turned to glass. Daria began to notice things she had once ignored, the strange new servants in the corridors, the faint smell of resin and smoke that followed the queen mother's retinue, the uneasy glances exchanged by the older concubines. Soon, whispers began again. This time they spoke of a man, a craftsman brought from the western provinces, known only as Artaban, once a sculptor of temples and royal statues. He had been summoned to Susa not for marble, but for flesh. The Queen Mother, aging yet vain, had become obsessed with youth. The deaths in the harem had stirred rumors beyond the court walls, and she feared losing the king's devotion to younger beauties. Artaban's skill, it was said, could preserve perfection, not in stone, but in living bodies. He came to the harem like a priest entering a shrine, his hands pale from years of mixing wax and oils. In the women's eyes, he was neither man nor healer, but something between tormentor and god. Each week, the attendants brought him a new subject, a concubine deemed imperfect, scarred, or fading. He would spend hours in silence, applying pastes that stung like fire, carving small instruments from ivory, and binding the flesh in linen soaked with unguents of strange scent. Some emerged pale but unmarked. Others never returned. Daria watched from the shadows one evening as Artaban performed his work upon a young girl named Atossa, whose only flaw had been a faint scar near her collarbone. The Queen Mother observed from her cushioned seat, expressionless. Artaban's hands moved like those of a sculptor over marble, precise, reverent, merciless. When he finished, Atossa's skin gleamed like polished alabaster. Yet when she tried to rise, she collapsed, her breath ragged. "She is perfect," the Queen Mother said softly. "Let her rest." By morning, Atossa was dead. Artaban said nothing. His tools were cleaned with wine, and the attendants carried her body away as though it were part of the ritual, one more offering to beauty's cruel altar. The harem changed after that. Mirrors appeared in every chamber, polished bronze reflecting each woman's face like a silent threat. They began to fear their own reflections, to touch their skin as if it might betray them. Daria, once proud of her grace, now avoided her own image, terrified of being chosen next. But Artaban was not the monster they imagined. Daria saw it in his eyes one night as he passed her in the corridor, a hollow, exhausted gaze like a man already damned by his own skill. Later, she learned from Parnaka that Artaban's wife had died years before, disfigured by a failed treatment ordered by another queen. Since then, he had lived as a slave to the art that destroyed him. One evening, Daria entered his workshop unseen. The air was thick with incense. On the table lay not a woman, but a mask shaped in her own likeness, molded from wax and gold dust. Beneath it, a small vial labeled only with her name. She fled, heart pounding, realizing what the sculptor was doing. The Queen Mother had ordered him to recreate each concubine's face in wax before her renewal. A collection of perfect visages, trophies of beauty reclaimed by cruelty. And in the center of his chamber, half hidden in shadow, lay rows of silent masks staring at nothing, immortal, flawless, and forever dead. Autumn arrived over Susa like a slow sickness. The heat did not fade, yet the air grew heavy with decay. The once lavish gardens began to wither, the lotus pools clouded with rot. In the women's quarters, the scent of rose oil mingled with the odor of fear. No one spoke of Artaban, yet his masks lingered, displayed along the Queen Mother's private gallery like silent idols to her vanity. She had begun to wear the faces of others. During the feasts, she appeared veiled in silk, the glint of polished gold beneath it. Each mask bore the likeness of one lost concubine, younger, flawless, frozen in beauty. Even the king, it was said, could no longer tell which face belonged to his mother and which to the dead. Daria watched it unfold from the shadows. The Queen Mother's reign over the harem had turned fevered. She no longer sought devotion, only dominance, to remind the king that all beauty, all pleasure, all obedience flowed through her hand. And yet, behind that veil, madness festered. The breaking point came during the Festival of Fire, a night sacred to Ahura Mazda, when offerings of oil and cedar were burned to cleanse the sins of the year. The king decreed that the ceremony would be held in the inner courtyard, where the queen mother would lead the rites of purification. That evening, every brazier in Susa blazed. The harem gathered, their faces lit by orange flame, their jewels reflecting the inferno. Daria stood among them, trembling beneath her veil. She felt the heat on her skin, the scent of burning oil thick in her lungs. Then the queen mother appeared, robed in crimson, her veil shimmering with the light of fire. Upon her face rested one of Artaban's masks, the face of Nisara, the drowned girl. A murmur ran through the crowd. Some women turned away in horror. The king's expression remained unreadable. Raising her arms, the queen mother began the chant, her voice echoing like wind through hollow stone. Let the impurities of the flesh be burned away. Let the beauty of devotion remain eternal. Servants poured oil into the flames until they roared high enough to lick the bronze gates. Then she called the names of the fallen, those who had sinned, betrayed, or defied the throne. Each name spoken was followed by silence, each silence heavier than the last. When she reached Elisha's name, Daria's stomach clenched. But it was the final name that froze her blood. Daria of Parthia. For a moment, she thought she had misheard. But the attendants were already moving, their hands reaching for her arms. Panic seized her. She struggled, cried out, but the drums drowned her voice. She was dragged toward the fire, where the queen mother stood smiling behind her borrowed face. Then something changed. A low hiss echoed through the courtyard, the sound of oil spilling where it should not. A torch fell. Flames leapt outward, consuming the silken draperies, racing along the ground toward the wooden scaffold where the masks hung. Screams erupted. The masks began to melt, gold and wax dripping like tears. The queen mother turned, clutching her veil, as the fire caught her robes. Her scream was swallowed by the roar of the inferno. Daria, half conscious, felt herself pulled away by unseen hands, perhaps Parnaka's, perhaps another slave's. She remembered only the smell of burning silk and the sight of faces dissolving in the fire, their perfection undone at last. By dawn, the queen mother was gone. Only fragments of her veil remained, fused to the marble like a shadow that would never fade. Susa awoke to silence. The king retreated to his private chambers. The sculptor was never seen again. And Daria, trembling and singed, stood among the ashes, realizing that beauty had not perished in the flames. It had simply changed its master. When dawn rose after the fire, Susa lay beneath a veil of gray ash. The palace still stood, but its heart was hollowed. Charred silk hung like skin from the rafters, and the scent of oil clung to the corridors. For 3 days, the king did not speak. His mother's ashes were gathered in a gold urn, placed within the inner sanctum, and sealed with resin in silence. But silence does not bury sin. The harem was disbanded. The surviving women, fewer than half, were sent to distant estates or confined to temples under the guise of purification. Daria remained, chosen by decree of the king himself. Whether by pity or cruelty, she was bound to the palace, the last witness to its ghosts. It was then that the workers began the reconstruction of the lower halls. Beneath the scorched courtyards, they uncovered passages older than the Achaemenid kings, corridors carved into the earth, lined with jars, bones, and inscriptions written in the forgotten tongues of Elam. The priests called it blasphemy to disturb them. But the king ordered them opened. He said the dead would hold their tongues. He was wrong. The tombs were narrow, their walls painted with scenes of ancient queens and their attendants. Women laid to rest beside jars of perfume, ivory combs, and mirrors of polished bronze. But when the torchlight struck the frescoes, the paint seemed to shimmer, as though the eyes of the buried watched from beneath the stone. The first men who entered refused to return. They spoke of faint voices in the dark, of whispers rising from the sealed jars, of a chill that crept even where the fire had not touched. The king dismissed them, calling it fear. Yet each night thereafter, the same sounds reached Daria's chamber, a faint murmur, like the rustle of silk on stone. One evening, she descended the stair alone, following the sound. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, the corridor opened into a chamber that had not been marked on any plan. Within it stood 12 sarcophagi, each shaped like a sleeping woman. Their faces were identical, serene, beautiful, unnatural. On the central tomb, a name had been carved, Amestris, Mother of Kings. The Queen Mother's likeness stared up from the stone, lips parted as if whispering a curse. And beside her, placed with deliberate care, lay one of Artaban's golden masks, half melted, fused to the lid. Daria fell to her knees. It was not a tomb. It was a collection. The women of Susa, those who had vanished, drowned, purified, or burned, had been entombed here long before the fire. Their remains had been arranged like offerings, their faces immortalized in wax and gold. The Queen Mother had not only ruled the living, she had claimed the dead. As Daria stared into the hollow eyes of the masks, a faint breath stirred the air. It was not wind. The whisper rose, soft, feminine, and countless. Words she could not understand, yet which chilled her blood with recognition. They were calling her name. The torches flickered. Daria stumbled backward, heart hammering, as the lid of one sarcophagus shifted ever so slightly. A sound escaped from within, a sigh, long and weary, as if exhaled by centuries. When she fled the chamber, the whispers followed, not loud, not shrieking, but constant, like a memory that would never die. By dawn, she stood upon the balcony, overlooking the ruined gardens. The sun touched the ash and turned it silver. Yet beneath her feet, the earth still murmured. The voices of Susa's forgotten women, their secrets too heavy for silence. And for the first time, Daria understood that the city itself was their tomb, and she, its last keeper. In the weeks following the discovery of the tombs, Susa became a city that whispered even in daylight. The king withdrew entirely from public life, seen only by the priests and the eunuchs who guarded his inner court. Among them was Parnaka, the harem's old keeper, the man who had once stood between life and ruin for so many of the palace's women. To most, he was a relic of the old order, obedient, voiceless, loyal. But beneath that still face lay a secret that had been buried longer than the Queen Mother's tomb. Daria found him one evening in the abandoned Hall of Mirrors, where the melted masks of the concubines still clung to the walls like molten ghosts. He stood before the reflection of his own scarred face, whispering something she could not hear. When she spoke his name, he turned, not startled, but resigned. "You should not have gone below," he said. "The tombs were never meant to be opened." She asked him why the Queen Mother had done it, why she had buried the women like idols. Parnaka hesitated. Then, with a voice heavy as stone, he said, "Because she feared the curse that made her powerful, and because she thought she could pass it to another." In that moment, Daria saw the truth in his eyes, the reflection of guilt that no servant could bear alone. Parnaka had not merely served the Queen Mother. He had protected her secret, fed her lies, and buried her crimes beneath the earth. It was he who had arranged the purifications. He who had chosen which women were to vanish. Each act had been signed not by the Queen's hand, but by his. "It was my duty," he said softly, as if the words could excuse the horror. But duty, in Susa, was another name for blood. That night, Daria followed him through the northern passage where the air smelled of incense and decay. There, in a small shrine lit by flickering lamps, she saw something that made her tremble. Upon the altar lay fragments of gold masks, shards of broken mirrors, and a scroll marked with the royal seal. It was an edict written months earlier, sealed by the king. "The harem shall be purified of corruption, and its keepers made holy through obedience." The Queen Mother had not acted alone. Parnaka's voice broke as he confessed. The king had feared the growing influence of the harem, its beauty, its whispers, its power over men. The purges had been a plan of state disguised as devotion. The Queen Mother's madness had been useful until it was no longer convenient. When her vanity became dangerous, he had ordered her destruction by fire, framing it as divine retribution. "He killed his own mother," Dario whispered. Parnaka nodded, tears cutting through the dust on his cheeks. "And I carried the torch." Silence filled the chamber. Daria felt the walls closing in, the realization that the horror she had survived was not born of one woman's cruelty, but of an empire's design. Parnaka reached for the dagger at his belt. "There is one duty left to fulfill," he said, kneeling before the altar. Before she could stop him, he drew the blade across his throat, a final act of penance offered to the ghosts he had served. The blood pooled upon the gold masks, reflecting the flickering light like molten rubies. Daria fled the shrine, her mind hollow, her breath ragged. Behind her, the echoes of his dying words followed. "The king still breathes. And while he does, so does the curse." By dawn, Parnaka's body was gone. Only the blood remained, drying slowly upon the altar, sealing the final secret of the harem in crimson silence. The city of Susa awoke under a blood-colored dawn. The fires that had devoured the Queen Mother's tomb still smoked in the distance, carrying with them the scent of burnt myrrh and death. The palace walls, once gilded with laughter, painted with silk and music, now trembled under the silence of the living. Daria walked through the empty corridors as if through a grave. The marble floors were cold with dew, the air thick with the ghost of incense. Every echo of her steps seemed to awaken memories, the cries of the vanished, the songs once sung in the courtyard when the harem was still alive. The king sat alone in the hall of judgment. His crown, tarnished by age and grief, hung askew upon his head. His eyes were hollow, not from lack of sleep, but from the weight of his own history. When he saw Daria enter, he did not speak. She knelt before him, her heart torn between fear and hatred. Between them lay a silence older than both. "Your mother," she said at last, "is at peace." The king's gaze shifted to the pillars carved with lions. "Peace," he murmured, "is for those who are forgotten." He rose from his throne with the slow weariness of a man who has buried his own soul. "You think I do not dream of them? Every night, the harem walks in my sleep. Their hands cold, their faces hidden. I hear the queen's voice whisper from the ashes, asking if I have replaced her yet." Daria's hands trembled. "And have you?" He smiled faintly, the smile of a ruler who no longer rules. "I have replaced nothing. I have only preserved what I destroyed." From behind the throne, two eunuchs entered, carrying a bronze chest. Inside, wrapped in layers of perfumed linen, lay hundreds of small ivory figurines, each carved in the likeness of a woman's face. Some were delicate and serene, others distorted by terror. The king touched them one by one, his fingers gentle, almost loving. "These were their offerings," he said. Each time one was chosen for purity, her likeness was carved. The scent of frankincense and blood was the seal of remembrance. I could not let them vanish. Daria felt the truth crush her like a stone. The tombs, the purges, the mirrors, the masks, all had been part of a single ritual, an empire's obsession with control disguised as sanctity. "Why tell me this now?" she whispered. "Because you are the last," the king replied. "The last breath of that house. You carry what remains of its curse." He placed one of the ivory figures in her hands, a face she recognized as her own. Her knees weakened. "When was this carved?" "The day you were chosen," he said softly. "The day I promised the gods your obedience." Tears blurred her sight. The perfume of the ancient wrappings filled her lungs, sweet, suffocating. Outside, The priests began to chant for dawn. The empire stirred once more, unaware that its heart was rotting beneath its own splendor. The king sank back into his throne, his voice fading like incense smoke. Let the chroniclers write that Susa fell not to war nor to famine, but to beauty, the most dangerous power of all. Daria turned away. In the courtyard, the wind carried the scent of roses over the ashes. The sun rose slowly over the ruined domes, gilding the bones of the dead in light. She whispered to the wind, her voice trembling with defiance and grief, "If beauty destroyed empires, then memory shall rebuild them." As she left the palace, the bronze doors closed behind her with a sound like final judgment. The empire of perfumed bones was silent once more, but its story, like the fragrance of decay, would never fade.